Hi, folks. In this video, we're going to go over the Daimler Chrysler case. This is a fascinating case, and it's got quite a lot of detail and some very interesting principles that I hope you have had a chance to think about by now. It has a special meaning for me, too, since a lot of my consulting experience over almost 20 years involved acquisitions, mergers, and divestments in our strategic planning consulting practice. So this case is quite familiar to me, and it should be especially interesting to you for one reason, if no other, and that is that it's probably the single most unsuccessful, badly conducted merger in the annals of business literature. So this is this one set the record. It was really a major collection of mistakes. So I want to run through the case with you, not necessarily following the outline of the case in your textbook, but simply to pick up on some important aspects of the case. And after we're finished with that, I'll conclude with a little summary that just provides you with the specific answers to the question that you were asked about this case, so that you can judge your own answer by that and perhaps understand why you got the grade that you did. Incidentally, one student got an A+ for this assignment, and that's because that student followed the instructions that I've been giving you in videos throughout the course. And that is to search through the chapter and find the principles in the chapter that fit the case best. Now, there are actually two places in the chapter where you can get some guidelines for answering the questions. One set of guidelines is on page 412, and a couple people used those guidelines. But the real pay dirt is on pages 414 and 415, where you'll find a list of 5 guidelines for success in collaborative undertakings, and mergers are a collaborative undertaking, among other things. So this person virtually went down that list of 5 items and gave good explanations for why and how those items applied. I think what I may do when I send your papers back to you is take the name off the paper, but let those of you who did not follow this approach see how it turned out when that approach indeed was followed. That's basically what I've been trying to get you to do throughout this case. So with that, I will push my hair back if I can. I've got one little bit of hair who decides it wants to do its own thing, so I better give up. Okay, so let's get started here. And to do that, I have to come off the screen a moment and bring up the first set of slides. And there we go. Let me take a little drink of tea here. One aspect of this case that the authors neglected was the impact of the economy, the US industrial economy, on Chrysler. And so let's take a look at that. If I can get the slides to switch. There we go. So here's a graph of the US GDP growth rate. And in some cases, it wasn't growing. And Chrysler's bumpy ride, as I called it. So Chrysler and Daimler agreed to merge in 1998. That's item number 1 on this screen. And you can see at that point that the US economy was bumping along pretty well at about 5% growth rate, which is really good. However, something happened shortly afterwards. It actually began in 1999, late 99, and went on through 2001. I remember that recession very well because it had quite an impact. You can see the effect on the GDP and the growth rate in the chart. And the effect of that decline or that recession was just terrible on the US auto industry and especially Chrysler. Well, the folks in Germany at Daimler almost seemed to blame the recession on Chrysler's management. And of course, there wasn't much that Chrysler really could do about it. And we'll see in later slides, but you probably remember several plants were closed, lots of people were laid off, and substantial losses were sustained. Now, whether Chrysler's management could have done a better job responding or not can be argued. But the primary driver of results here was the doggone recession. But during this period of time, as you may recall from the case, the Daimler folks were very critical of Chrysler. And whether it was because they just got up and left because they retired or because they were fired, a lot of Chrysler executives left the company and were replaced by Daimler's German managers. And I'm sure you recall that the culture, the way in which companies operate in Germany, as opposed to the United States, and specifically the way Daimler operated versus Chrysler's was quite different. The two companies had very different cultures and approaches to management. So in 2007, the relationships between the two managements were not going very well. There was a lot of disappointment and low morale at Chrysler. And in 2007, the economy was beginning to decline, had begun to decline, and Chrysler and Daimler Benz, who by that time were dominating this merged corporation, decided to divest, to sell Chrysler. And they sold it to an investment management company called Cerberus. And they sold, and there was a substantial loss to Daimler when that deal was done. But it was done, and Daimler was right. The US economy had begun to decline, and lo and behold, I'm sure that you know or should know that the US had a major recession in 2009 and 10, and it lasted into 2011 even, although in 2011 things were starting to get better. But this was a really serious decline. It was due to big mistakes by the U.S. banking industry in the way that it handled mortgages and collateralized debt obligation packages, CDOs, that contained many mortgages. They were packaged together like bonds, but they certainly didn't behave like bonds. And when people couldn't keep up with their mortgages, those collateralized debt obligations went sour, and so did Chrysler. So in 2009, Cerberus gave up. Chrysler Corporation went into bankruptcy, as did General Motors. You know, this was not a one company proposition. And the same is true back there in 2000 and 2001. Recessions have a pretty generalized impact on industry. And we had this very bad recession, and Chrysler went into bankruptcy. After the economy recovered and began to grow again, Fiat, the Italian company, acquired Chrysler by paying off the debt that it owed to the U.S. government. The government had provided quite a lot of funding to Chrysler to keep it alive. And so Fiat arranged the financing that enabled it to acquire Chrysler. And Chrysler is still part of Fiat today. Notice the far right side of this chart. We just had another recession, didn't we? And we're still impaired by it. So it would be interesting to talk to the Fiat people and the Chrysler people today to just see how things have gone financially since the pandemic. Now, at this point, I'm going to show you a short series of charts to show you some other impacts of the U.S. economy during this same period of time, just to give you a full flavor. So here are the manufacturers' orders generally. And you can see, and I put the same periods of time on the chart so you can track back to this one. And so you can see that things were going pretty well with regard to manufacturers' orders for motor vehicles and parts. The auto industry was doing pretty well. It had a little dip one year, but or for a short time in a year, but this was enough with this rapid growth to encourage Daimler to do the deal with Chrysler. And then things happened and the recession occurred, and those new orders really dropped off, didn't they? And then we had a recovery, and it looked like that recovery was moving along pretty well. But Daimler by this time had realized that there were risks of another recession and wanted to get out of Chrysler anyway to get its money back, some of its money back. But when it sold the Chrysler to Cerberus, it did not get all of its money back. It suffered a substantial loss. But on balance, Daimler probably did the right thing, because you can see what happened when that deep recession occurred to auto orders for motor vehicles during the recession. They just plummeted to an all-time low. It was really bloody. And then after the bankruptcy of Chrysler, over time, and it took quite a while, the auto industry began to recover, and that's when Fiat acquired it. Here is the way, and this chart starts much sooner than the others do, and that's why all the numbers are off on the right. But you can see that this is capacity utilization. One of the big problems Chrysler had, and that problem was the primary motive for doing the deal with Daimler, is that it had a lot more capacity than orders. Its plant capacity was a lot greater than the demand for cars. And in this industry, capacity utilization had been pretty good. It dipped and it has dipped. It's been very cyclical. But when Daimler and Chrysler merged, capacity utilization was a little over 90%. And then, boom, things happened. We have the recession of 2000, 2001, recovery, and then it starts back down again. And at this point, Daimler says, we got to get rid of Chrysler. It did that, and they guessed right, because you can see what happened to capacity utilization when the 2009, 2010 recession occurred, and then things recovered. So you can explain a lot of what goes on in this case by looking at the economy. Incidentally, here's the trend in gas prices, nice and stable. When the original deal was done, just to put salt on the wound, gasoline prices soared up to about $3, and later on more than that. But at the time that Daimler sold Chrysler to Cerberus, you can see how much more expensive gasoline was. This put a big pressure on engineering and the design engineers at all automobiles, because they had to come up with engines that were more efficient in their use of gasoline. And you can see that when the recession began in 2009, gas prices were really high. And then the recession occurred. The demand for gasoline dropped as the demand for cars dropped, and supply demand shifted the pricing of gasoline. And so here we have the bankruptcy of Chrysler, and later on the acquisition by Fiat. And notice that Fiat saw that marketing conditions were a lot better in this industry in 2015, when gasoline prices were coming back down. So that's a rather lengthy review of the economic forces at work in this case. But the authors of the case did not explain this background. And I think that the economic trends during the time when this case occurs explain a lot of what happened, but you were not given that explanation. Okay. Here's an exhibit from, I believe, page 412, but it talks about motives for foreign direct investment. But these could also be the motives for, a foreign direct investment can be an acquisition of a company in another country. And if you have a merger, it's the same thing going in two directions. So we get some insight from this chart in your book. Clearly, Daimler was seeking to gain access to a larger market, the US market. They were here, but they weren't really a force in the market, and they wanted to be. also wanted to, as I'm sure you noticed in the case, introduce cars that were more popular in the United States, such as mid-sized cars and cars that were not quite as luxurious or expensive as Mercedes cars are in Europe or the United States. Chrysler also wanted to gain access to Europe because it had all that extra capacity, and it just wanted to use its capacity. That was the driving force for Chrysler in this case. It had all that extra capacity and all that extra cost of that capacity. So, and other auto companies didn't want to buy it because they had the same problem. So clearly, if there were an opportunity to make Chrysler cars in Europe, then that's what they wanted to do. And just as much, they wanted to make more Chrysler cars in the US and ship them to Europe. Well, okay, resource and asset seeking. Chrysler respected the engineering and research capabilities of Daimler and wanted to gain access. They hoped that Daimler could help them in developing new cars. Daimler, on the other hand, saw Chrysler's big distribution system, all those dealers, and all the resources that could be leveraged in the U.S. And that includes the ability to purchase in larger quantities at a lower price. And that takes us to the right-hand column where we see Daimler's motive to lower its costs by taking advantage of that big procurement system at Chrysler. That was one of Daimler's goals. And by the way, most of these goals never were achieved. Finally, in the case of both companies, they wanted to put their production close to the customer with the intent of making a more effective marketing proposition to dealers and drivers. Okay, so just to recap, what are these motives of the two companies? And first we'll look at just the general ones, which I've already talked about a bit, and then we'll take a look at each company's motives. So as you should recall from the case, rivalry in this industry was really intense when this case occurred. Production capacity exceeded demand, especially at Chrysler. Not only that, new supply was coming in from Japan, and Japanese cars were Chinese cars were going into Europe. So we've got supply going up, and at the same time, the capacity already exceeded demand. Not only that, but the costs of labor and material were rising. We saw in the graphs that we looked at, industry sales were bouncing up and down. The buyers, whether they were the dealers or the customer, could demand lower prices. And what that meant was that the manufacturers and the distributors really had to get their costs down. And one way to do that is scale economy. And so by bringing these two companies together, the hope was to get their combined costs down. That was a good idea. The Daimler management sought opportunities to increase production and sales by gaining access to new markets, particularly in the US. And here were these nice empty factories that Chrysler had, so that Daimler could just tool up and start making cars in them. Chrysler hoped to take advantage of market expansion in Europe. To do that, it would be necessary to take advantage of Daimler Chrysler's operations, and Daimler didn't have the same overcapacity problem that Chrysler did. So its motive to accommodate Chrysler's requirements were not as strong as Chrysler's motives were to accommodate Daimler's. So here are Daimler's motives and goals, if you will, in a nutshell, to get broader geographic markets, to flesh out their product line and make a broader product line that would make them a larger and a more important factor in the automotive industry. So Daimler intended to make some cars that were not as expensive as those that are made in Europe. And the reason it hoped to do that was that there is a larger middle market in the United States. And so the idea was to access the US middle market as well as the luxury car market. And Chrysler had lots of capabilities to help them do that, plenty of capacity, very large supply chain with lots of suppliers, more suppliers, and with more capacity than existed in Europe. So if it all went well, Daimler would have a more balanced portfolio. It would be able to access Chrysler's supply chain as well as its dealers, which were nationwide, and through scale economy, realize cost reductions in the neighborhood of $3 billion a year. And of course, that was back in 1998 when $3 billion was real money. Chrysler's motives were a lot simpler. Chrysler wanted to fill those plants because empty plants are just costly, that's all. They don't add any profit, they just add cost. So whatever device might be available to utilize that excess capacity, Chrysler was interested in. And so making Mercedes, perhaps the mid-sized, the middle market cars, and the Chrysler plants would fill the bill. And the opportunity to sell its cars in Europe and elsewhere, in other countries too, where Daimler had plants, was a further appeal. And as I mentioned earlier, Chrysler respected Daimler's technology and engineering, its research and development, and it hoped that Daimler would be able to share some of those resources and skills. Well, as you know, the merger didn't turn out very well. It was a very unhappy marriage. And the primary reason, in my opinion, wasn't Chrysler's lack of talent. And I think you get some suggestion of that in this case. But instead, that US recession just blasted the auto industry. So with all that extra cost, Chrysler lost $1.25 billion, had to close 6 plants, lay off 26,000 people. As that occurred, you can sort of feel in this case that the Germans were blaming the Americans for poor performance during this time. And the poor Americans couldn't change the recession, but they got blamed by the Germans for being bad executives. Lots of Chrysler executives and managers left the company, either willingly or unwillingly, and they were replaced by German managers who did not respect Chrysler's managers. And so Chrysler essentially became a subsidiary of Daimler, and the morale at Chrysler really dropped. As you might imagine from all that we've said so far, the relationship between the two countries wasn't very good. Chrysler's people were resentful. They were offended by Daimler's sometimes rudeness or offensive behavior. The Chrysler folks were defensive. They didn't really contribute or volunteer to solve problems. There was a fundamental difference in the way European countries, especially German countries, go about organization and management of the organization as opposed to Chrysler's. Daimler's, as you may recall, was very stiff, very, I'm trying to think of the right word, but militaristic. Chrysler's was more participative, whereas the German organization had a rank and file. It had a very stiff order to its organization and its authoritarian structure. Things were not quite that stiff and authoritarian at Chrysler. Now, Chrysler was not loose. Again, you can get the wrong impression here. Chrysler had a good, solid, well-defined organization too, but the American approach was simply not as authoritarian and was more participative than the German approach. So we have the centralized decision-making as opposed to decentralized, authoritative versus participative. And just to make it a little bit worse, remember that World War II occurred and the Americans beat the Germans. So the Germans always have sort of a subconscious awareness of that. And they don't necessarily want to get back, but they certainly want to assert themselves in many cases. There were indeed integration problems. Chrysler plants could not produce Mercedes cars as Daimler hoped. Chrysler minivans were attempted in some Mercedes plants, but they didn't fit. There are a lot of reasons for these. The measurement systems, the decimal measurement systems in Europe, and I'm having trouble getting the right word for that, but the actual measurement systems are different in Europe versus the US in some cases. So not only that, Mercedes dealers in the United States and Europe didn't welcome Chrysler cars. The dealers felt that the Chrysler cars were a lower class of cars or a middle class perhaps, and that their customers would see this as a step down and not the kind of car that they wanted to find when they walked into a Mercedes dealership and showroom. And so that was a big frustration for Daimler. Now, I think that frustration could have been overcome in enough time. If there had not been a recession, I think that there were lots of opportunities to solve that problem. It could have been that there would be a different platform or a different label put on the Chrysler cars that were made for Mercedes, the same way that General Motors has had different nameplates over the years, whether it's Chrysler, Buick, remember Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and so forth. So if Mercedes were the Cadillac, Chrysler might have been able to build a Chevrolet or a Buick type of car. But these two organizations just couldn't get their act together and couldn't work together. And so they didn't have time to get that kind of project going before the recession hit. The supply chains were not consolidated, and that is really a surprise because remember that Mercedes wanted to save a lot of money by taking advantage of the American procurement system and American suppliers. Nor did Daimler provide Chrysler with access to research and engineering as Chrysler hoped. And there's talk in the case about there wasn't an opportunity to make small cars for the Chinese market. That just comes up at the very end, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with the reason why this merger did not succeed. Instead, the Chinese market was something in the way of a long-range plan. But the number one problem in this case, as I'm sure you've figured out by now, is, if I can get it here, ill will, and then some. Okay, so here's an exhibit from one of the pages in your textbook, and the advantages and disadvantages of doing collaborative ventures like mergers. And if they're a good merger, they can facilitate transfer of knowledge, resources, and capabilities between the partners. It's too bad that these companies couldn't make that happen. And if they have common goals, then they can form strategic plans to bring the resources of the combined partners to pursue those goals. On the other hand, if you've got two big corporations on different sides of the Atlantic Ocean, coordination certainly was going to be a problem. The only way to deal with that problem is to prepare very careful plans before the merger is closed. And we'll get to that point a bit later. It's also difficult to undo a merger. Once a merger is done, you just can't, say, oh, I don't like this. Let's call it all off. There are shareholders and so forth. So merger is a pretty permanent thing. And there could be political risk, but in some cases, but there were not in this case. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, you have to ask a question. Did Daimler and Chrysler really have common goals? And I think that the answer, you already know. The answer is no. And did they really collaborate together? And again, the answer is no. So on pages 414 and 415, you will find 5 success factors for collaborative ventures, including mergers. I included the slide just as it was given to us, but the narrative here isn't all that relevant. Half of global collaborative ventures fail in the first 5 years, and this was another one. But here are the 5 success factors. And as I say, one person in the class went to this page and discussed these 5 points, not a little bit, but in some depth, explaining how each one of these factors did come in or did not come into play. So being aware of cultural differences, I think probably these folks were aware, but not enough. Obviously, they became very destructive. Pursue common goals. The problem was there don't seem to have been common goals. Pay attention to planning. I would like to take pay attention to out. I left this here because this is the slide. But let me go to the last 2, and I'll come back to this one. Safeguard core competences. What's the problem here? These, but I inserted, but leverage them. And here we have all these competences, whether it's supply chain, engineering, research and development, distribution, dealers, it goes on and on. So these 2 companies had core competences that they safeguarded too much. They did not find ways to leverage them between the 2 companies. And finally, here comes the recession. And the auto industry is very cyclical. It's going to have recessions. But when the recession occurred, that was it for the Daimler Chrysler merger, as we now know. But back to number 3, planning. Let me, as a matter of fact, this is the last slide. The next slide simply asks questions that I asked another class. Would this merger's results have been different if those recessions hadn't occurred? And then question 14.7. So let me just see if I can undo this thing here. There we go. We'll finish up very quickly in just a minute, where we'll go through the questions and answer them specifically. But again, I've done a lot of investment banking and acquisitions and divestments in my career as Vice President of Strategic Planning and Corporate Development at Phillips Industries, and as Managing Partner of a consulting firm that helped firms virtually around the world do strategic planning. And when the plans that we prepared called for acquisitions or divestments, then we helped our clients do those acquisitions and divestments. And what I can tell you for sure is that whenever you're going to go into any deal, acquisition or merger, and especially a complex merger, it's not the time to do strategic planning is not after the contract is signed. It's not after the deal is done. It's before the deal is done. You want to get the 2 parties together, and that was my job, was to get these parties together and develop what would be the game plan, maybe not in the excruciating detail that would come later with operational planning after the two companies were combined. But beforehand, there has to be an understanding between the two parties, whether it's the acquirer and the acquired, or the two merger partners. How are we going to do this? How's it going to be organized? What will the management structure be? What will our goals be? How will we go about generally pursuing those goals? What parts of the new organization will be responsible in general for accomplishing and pursuing these goals? Now, after the deal is done, sometimes partners find out that the folks that they joined up with were just giving lip service, and they had other motives. Things don't always go perfectly. But if you can do strategic planning, at least at a general level, before a deal is done, the chances for success are monstrously larger than if you don't. Well, in this case, Chrysler and Daimler-Benz did not do strategic planning before they combined, and the result was a mess. Okay, now let's wrap up. Oops, I can't do that. You can't see it yet. I have to do it the hard way. So, and I hope this will be it. There we go. Okay, so as we said before, here are those motives that we talked about already. And these motives are the driving forces for goal setting. So to gain access to new markets, obviously, both companies, especially Daimler, reducing sourcing and production costs by taking advantage of Chrysler's supply lines, a big motive for Daimler. Locating production near customers, maybe Chrysler as well as Daimler, access to knowledge. Chrysler wanted to benefit from what Daimler knew how to do and to access that know-how. So we've gone over that. Let's move to the next one. Here are some key questions that are on page 412. And a couple people went to these questions and picked off the ones that are relevant. They're not all relevant, but what are the questions that managers should ask when they're getting ready to go in to a collaborative venture, like a merger? Clearly, Chrysler didn't understand how dependent they were going to become on Daimler. And if they had understood that ahead of time, they probably wouldn't have done the deal. And yet, you know, if you turn this question upside down, you know, how will we be essentially the acquirer, the dominant partner? And that's what Daimler expected. And they were. It's just that dominance was part of the reasons for the undoing of the deal. How will responsibilities and competences be shared? That should have been answered in the preliminary planning, right? I'm going to skip the questions in black. What other risks do we face? I think for Chrysler, it was probably that they could not go about developing their own lines of new cars independently. They were essentially chartered with developing new Mercedes cars. Today, as part of Fiat, that's not the case. They're developing new Chrysler cars. Um, will we create growth opportunities? And there's no question about it. That was the answer to this question was yes. That's why both of these companies went into the deal, although Daimler's motives for growth were a lot greater than Chrysler's. Remember that Chrysler's motives were to put some kind of production in those empty plants. And finally, how will the venture be managed? And again, that was not taken into consideration formally before the deal was done. I'm sure that Daimler had a very good idea of how the venture was going to be managed. And I'm sure that Chrysler was completely unaware of how it was going to be managed, but had much different ideas. They had the idea it was going to be a merger of equals, and it certainly wasn't that. And so here are those 5 critical success factors again on pages 414 and 415. Be aware of cultural differences, pursue common goals, pay attention to planning. My golly, yes. Safeguard core competences, but leverage them and adjust to shifting environmental circumstances, which are going to happen in an industry like automotive, where cyclical fluctuations can have major impacts on the industry. So with that, I will end this rather lengthy review of this very important case. This is one of the most important cases in this particular part of strategic management that deals with foreign direct investment, acquisitions, divestments, and mergers. So I'm sorry that the video was so long, but I hope you have had a chance to look at it and think about it, because it could influence your thinking when you get into management and see a situation in your company where an acquisition or a divestment or a merger might occur. And with that, I will try very hard to end this video.